welcome to the Play Typer Guy podcast. Joining me again is my friend Cliston Brown, all around political whiz. Thank you for joining us, Cliston.
Oh, thank you, Stephen. Always glad to be here.
So I'd written about this earlier this week. I'm interested in your thoughts on this from the start. Registration for the Democratic Party has been dropping over the past 4 years. Definitely kind of a shock, given that we were thinking the party itself has been moving towards, trying to win over particularly Republican voters who are upset with Trumpism. What are your thoughts of that? Like, what do you think is the larger driver of this? Is it real? And why are we not sort of seeing what you think you would see based on, the sort of Never Trump movement?
Well, it's absolutely real. I mean, the numbers are what they are. We have seen that in every state, every single state that tracks voter registration, that registers voters by party, 30 states, Democratic numbers have gone down and Republican numbers have gone up. This is happening across the country. Red states, blue states, doesn't matter. Happening everywhere. And I think that speaks to a very, very serious problem for the Democratic Party. We talk about the Never Trump movement. Well, here's the thing. The Never Trump movement was never that big. Most Republicans got in line behind Donald Trump. The few who jumped out just weren't that big of a number. But the people who are leaving the Democratic Party is a bigger number. And that is a very, very big problem.
And why do you think this is happening? I have my own theories. A lot of it happening after the pandemic. I know that seems like a very big point of how a lot of people, particularly the folks who are leaving the party, viewed the party might have changed during COVID, particularly giving schools what was being taught in schools and their sense about the shutdowns coupled with crime in certain and Democratic run cities. What are your thoughts on that? Because we've been seeing so many different arguments as to what is occurring and what wasn't. But like just going back to 2020, how would you define sort of the challenges the party has faced?
I think that the biggest challenge the party has faced is not just Donald Trump, but the party's reaction to Donald Trump, which on one hand has been understandable, but on the other hand has ventured into a level of just unhinged rhetoric. I think that unfortunately, to a great degree, a lot of that response to the average person has looked irrational. So I think that the party is developing a reputation as emotionally overwrought and unwilling to accept the results of a fair election, which is what Democrats often accuse Republicans of, and justly so. I think that certainly we've seen some very notable changes in the party. Until 2017, the Democratic Party was a party that rigorously enforced our borders. Barack Obama was decried by some people on the left as the so-called deporter in chief. That dynamic changed. I think that we have seen the trans women in women's sports issue take on saliency that it did not have prior to 2020. I think also the COVID pandemic also brought about a lot of social changes in our country. I feel like the time that we spent isolating from each other has had an impact on the way we interact with each other. And that impact tends to run more toward the sort of rugged individualism that Republicans always talk about, whereas Democrats have always been kind of more of a communitarian-based party. So there are a lot of things cutting against the Democratic Party right now. But I really think that these changes in registration numbers, which have been happening for some time, really should have been a canary in the coal mine moment for the Democratic Party, and maybe might have clued them into the idea that they've got to be thinking about why are we losing all these people, and why are these people going to the Republican Party? It was a cherished myth in the Democratic Party that as long as America became more and more diverse, racially and culturally, that it would only benefit the Democratic Party. There was a presumption there that African Americans would continue voting Democratic at more than a 9-to-1 clip. There was a presumption there that Latinos would continue to favor Democrats by a 2-to-1 margin or better. Those presumptions were wrong. And I think that as the party becomes more culturally progressive, they're losing a lot of the more socially conservative voters of color who used to vote Democratic and are now not entirely convinced that the party is where they are.
And something you had said that sort of reminded me of this as well, because when we talk about the losses, I had noticed this with RFK, who's I consider a loon and whatever. But again, a lot of the anti-vaccine rhetoric that became more heated, obviously, after COVID. But I'm in Oregon over here, where there's no fluoride in the water. There are people who, again, this is pre-COVID, but who are like trying to abstain from getting measles, shots for vaccinations for their kids. And I'd written about how they were sort of what I would call the Phoebe Buffet from Friends liberals, right? People didn't really kind of believe in science. They were flakes. They were kooks. I disagreed with them, but they were part of a Democratic coalition. And I've noticed that sometimes the party has this idea of saying like, these people were never part of our coalition. So we don't like Bill Maher. We don't like Joe Rogan. We don't like RFK Jr. We don't like these people. They were never Democrats. Our party, but I was like, well, no, I mean, these are people who voted for Obama and Clinton. That's not to say we agree with them. It's just saying, okay, well, who are we getting in return if we're, that's becomes because people say like, there's no such thing as a purity test, just what our values are. But it's like, I don't know. The numbers aren't working if we are sort of, you have to have imperfect members of the coalition. I don't like, and maybe am I being naive? Was there a way to maintain those kooks, or are they just going to become MAGA and we have to find people who believe in science, that things change? So do we have to sort of accept loss, but then do a better job in kind of building up the numbers elsewhere? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm not sure where else the numbers can be built up. I mean, I just don't understand. I've often made a criticism of progressives and people on the left, which it's a little flippant, but I've often said that their biggest problem is they can't count. And the bottom line is this. In a country where neither liberals nor conservatives are in the majority, there's a number of people who are somewhere in the middle. And you're going to have people in your coalition that you may not agree with on everything, because there's no other way to get to 50% plus one. Republicans are doing a better job of getting people who they may not agree with 100% to go to their side. And they're doing that largely by not haranguing them at every turn if they happen to ever challenge the party orthodoxy on any issue. And I think one of the reasons that's happening is because a lot of the people who support Donald Trump are not even necessarily Republicans. They don't necessarily even care about the party. They're more conservative. If they're going to vote, they're probably going to vote Republican. But they're not as wedded to the ideology of their party on a point-by-point list the way that a lot of progressives and people on the left are. So I think there's more room for people who have a diversity of thought to go to the Republican Party, strangely enough. And that's a problem.
Yeah. And we've seen this whenever, there are issues. We've talked about the 80 to 20% issues and Democrats being too much, often on 20 or 10% issues. And I'm someone who I've support a lot of 20% or 10% issues, but my sense is, okay, well, how do I get this we have to get this to at least 50% or at least 80% in the party to get for a primary. And when I do those numbers, I posted this online. I got death threats of like, you hate these people because you're not full, but it's like, well, no, if I didn't care about them, I would just say, okay, do whatever. I mean, it's like, we have to get this, we have to convince. And there was sort of the idea of like, how dare you? Well, would you want to try to convince people that you should not be enslaved? Which, I've written about hostile empathy, about trying to make those comparisons that
Yeah.
only alienate people. But, well, yeah, if polls show that 70% of the population thought I should be enslaved, I need to sort of improve those numbers, because that's, I mean, that's just
Yeah.
how reality works. And I've seen that there's a challenge with how that is achieved. And I'm going to ask you about that, because what I've often seen is the problem is that not that you need to change the messaging or listen to the other side to get that number up. It is just that you have to yell louder
Right.
what you've already been saying, which doesn't make any sense to me. I think I've seen folks from Buttigieg and Sarah McBride have been harangued for even trying to see the other person's side, to try to get to like figure out like, how do we just try to build on this, because I get a sense that the party doesn't see what has happened over the past 4 years, of how numbers have been pushed down, how Republicans successfully demonized people and beliefs just by kind of going to a narrative that makes sense. Here's what your children are being taught. Here's what's happening to your children. And so we're not really responding in any sort of real way. I think when Harris was making democracy was at stake, and that was Democratic thing. And the exit polls would look like, oh yeah, this is great. Most Americans believe democracy is an existential issue right now. But she was, it actually was not breaking for her overwhelmingly,
Right.
because, it sounded as if Democrats were saying what's existential is our institutions and our norms. Oh, like, which the normal voter doesn't get. Whereas Trump was, and Trump was sort of saying, well, you can't walk down the street. You can't, there's, homeless encampments.
Yeah.
And I've mentioned this before. As I said, I interviewed someone who very kind of clearly laid it out for me. And here in Portland, which is just like, okay, well, the city shut down my livelihood, my business, because they said it was a public health hazard. And now I've opened back up. I'm hanging by a thread, and my foot traffic has dropped because there's like people, a tent outside my building, and the city does not believe that's a public health hazard worth addressing. And that kind of builds up. I mean, you're in California, right? And I want to talk about Gavin Newsom, because he's very California is very interesting, of the schism, right? So the rest of the world thinks that California is insane, and the governors obviously knew that the issue most likely is that key swing states believe that Newsom is too liberal. That would be the issue. But then there's a prominent segment of the Democratic Party that believes he is not liberal enough.
Yes.
Like, and examples will be like him cleaning up homeless encampments as if he went into a black neighborhood with the Klan and burned houses. Like, I looked at it, it's just like it, and that to me was one of my like, look, we can have empathy for homeless people.
Absolutely.
But I'm from the liberalism of the 80s or 90s, where it was like those same photos would be, oh, look, the governor has rolled up his sleeves and is cleaning up the litter and trash from our streets because we want our city to look clean. And that was what liberalism was like. No littering, no showing. But here it's like, how dare you do that? Which again is sort of the Democratic governance disconnect, right? Of how I think people are feeling about the party.
The first thing that came to mind was just the difference in approach and the difference in worldview, in that the Democratic Party has become the party of intellectuals. It has become the party of college-educated people. And we're approaching this the way you would approach an academic problem, a lot of theory. Whereas Trump and the Republicans are getting more to things that are actually affecting people's lives. It's a matter of the abstract versus the concrete, and which is more salient in politics. So you talk about these issues that affect quality of life in the cities, for instance. And on one hand, you've got this very high-minded academic view, and on the other hand, you've got the let's clear all this out so it can be safe and enjoyable for people who want to live and work and explore in the city. And one of those is going to land better than the other with most people, and we know which one that is. And you cannot run on a platform of all of these social problems. We can't do anything about that because we might be impinging upon the rights of homeless people. You can't win that way. You can't win that way. People want an orderly society in which to work and live their lives and raise their kids. And if you're out dodging, hypodermic needles on the streets, you've got people, blowing clouds of marijuana in your face. You've got people who are yelling at you, screaming at you, peeing in the streets. Most people are going to, on a gut level, think we have to get rid of this. And the problem, when there is a vacuum of leadership, which there has been, that somebody's going to fill that vacuum. And so if Democrats and progressives who run a lot of these major cities don't do anything about the problem, then the Republicans are, and I promise you, you're not going to like their solutions.
Mm-hmm.
So by abdicating the field, which is what Democrats have done, they have opened the door for Donald Trump and his merry band of MAGA goons to roll out the tanks.
And as someone who sort of studied the history of politics, right, and puts things in perspective, is the party in a unique situation in the sense that I have friends who are more liberal than I am and more conservative than I am, and they both said I don't want anything to do with the party, like obviously for different reasons. Has there been a case of have Democrats or Republicans ever been in that sort of situation where it's not like they're losing one end, but they're losing them from both?
That's a really good question, and I will have to admit that I haven't studied it enough to really say for sure. I will say that my guess is that may be what happened to a lot of parties that have died. If you go back and you look at the Whig Party, for instance, which was the precursor to the Republican Party in the 19th century, what happened there was that they were kind of torn in two different directions. You had the anti-slavery Whigs of the North and the pro-slavery Whigs of the South. And at some point, it became clear within the Whig Party that wasn't working, and the results were such that the Whig Party was basically completely non-viable anymore, except in a few pockets of the country. We see the Democratic Party going that direction today, where it is becoming increasingly less and less viable, except in a few pockets of the country, mostly urban, mostly coastal. And when a party gets to a point where it can't compete across the country, I don't know how you get back from that. And I think the Democratic Party is in a very precarious position today because there is so much of the country where having a D by your name is political death. It's over. You're not going to win. Mm-hmm. And what that creates is a situation where, well, let's say, the next census, California, New York, other states lose a number of seats. Now, all of a sudden, Democrats can no longer win the Electoral College by sweeping Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Now they need other states. Well, what if you can't compete in those other states? Mm-hmm. Then you've got a problem. What if you can't compete in large swaths of the country? You basically have to draw an inside straight to ever control either the House or the Senate. Democrats are now in a position where Republicans have a lot more leeway, a lot more margin for error. Democrats have to be perfect. Mm-hmm. Republicans just don't have to screw up too bad.
But it does seem as if within the party institution, there is sort of an issue, and I call this sort of perhaps the original sin from the 2016 election, where I felt there was like the wrong response to Sanders. There seemed to be so many ways you could have responded to him other than sort of the perception was like, oh, he's appealing to young people and white men, so we need to not do that and double down on identity. Was to me the worst response to Sanders, because at the core, the best you could say about him, he was trying to go in areas where Democrats had been sort of slipping off and sort of appeal to people who were sort of non-ideological on a class-based politics. And if you even talk about class-based politics, especially on social media, the backlash is huge from a lot of Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris supporters. And again, this is the mainstream left, right? The mainstream liberals. Can you speak to that, of what you've noticed and what you've seen, and especially today in a statement that Hakeem Jeffries made that I felt was sort of emblematic of the kind of where the party thinks it should be setting it, and how it's sort of gone out of control?
One of the biggest evolutions in my way of thinking about politics over the last few years has been that I have ultimately had to embrace the reality that identity politics fundamentally, whether it's intended to be or not, ends up being divisive. And I know that there will be knee-jerk reactions to that statement, but what I mean by that is this. If the Democratic Party increasingly puts itself in these boxes, then all it does is reduce the audience that is available to listen to what it has to say. A broader perspective of pushing forward solutions that benefit everybody is going to get a better hearing than always hearing about how this particular thing is going to negatively affect this group or that group or the other group. To the degree that that ever worked, it's not working anymore. Identity politics is not working anymore. To the degree that it works, it only works for Republicans. And I think that we now have an issue whereby if we talk about issues of class, it is seen as we're going to start offering the white working class certain things, and by inference or extension, start taking those things away from other groups, which is not necessarily true. But I think that is the feeling that exists. And it has become like a zero-sum game, where if you say anything that is beneficial to this group that we don't particularly like right now, and I'm not saying that from my perspective, but I mean from the perspective of the party as a whole, then that means that you are betraying or selling out or leaving behind the other groups that identify with your party. And ultimately, that is a road to nowhere, because the bottom line is this: 70+% of the electorate is white. That is an immutable rule of arithmetic that we can't get around. And if you continue in a way where Republicans can spin it that you've become anti-white, you're going to lose more and more of that share of the electorate. Now, here's the problem. There was a time when if you got 42 or 43% of the white vote as a Democrat, you were basically guaranteed to win, because you were getting 90+% of the black vote, you were getting 65, 70% of the Latino vote, and 42 or 43% of the white vote was going to do it for you. Now it doesn't, because in addition to the problem that I just described, we also have this problem, which is significant number of black and Latino voters who previously voted Democratic are not social progressives. And they are starting to move, particularly on a class level, among the working classes, in the direction of the Republicans. So now, you talk about, the problem with white voters, but you need more of them, not less of them, to win now, because you have fewer black voters and significantly fewer Latino voters voting Democratic. So if the Democratic Party continues to go down this path where everything is viewed through the prism of identity and race, it's going to be a losing message. It already is. And
Yeah.
whether people like that or not, it's reality. And if you want to accomplish anything for any of these demographic groups that you care about, you have to think about political reality, and you have to think about how you get to 50 plus 1%.
We've talked about politicians being in office too long or only caring about getting elected. But something I did hear from some progressives was like, there's more than just winning, which actually in politics is only winning. I get,
That's
but
right.
and it, as if there's some sort of that the moral argument is like, if I believe strongly about this 10% issue, I should go and advocate for that strong and somehow win.
Yeah.
But I won't, and without any obligation of like, well, if you and I are elected officials, don't we have an obligation to all our constituents? One, to hold that seat, to keep the Republicans out of office. And this is not about sacrificing anyone. It's just sort of saying, if this issue is going to cost us, here's the impact on the entire nation. And I mean, this is something that used to happen in politics all the time, and people have been in denial about it. Like, a lot of the left will insist that when you mention things like how Lincoln governed, or what Lincoln said to get elected, or what LBJ said, or what Barack Obama clearly taking a stance he didn't agree with in 2008 on same-sex marriage, right after Bush had used same-sex marriage as a wedge issue to drive people to the polls. There was data clear for that. So no Democrat supported same-sex marriage in 2008. And either there'll be no recognition that this happened, or that, oh, they could have won anyway if they'd been strong enough. And
yeah, we just got this, we see this self-serving loop of self-righteousness where, it becomes essentially an acceptance that you can't win. My point being here that you hear these people talk about, well, this is a 20% issue because those other 80% of people are bigots. And so what you're saying here is that essentially what they're saying is that we'll never win on this issue, and that's not the point. And it is the point, because how are you going to help those 20% if you don't win an election? And so sometimes you might have to soft pedal or downplay some of your positions. You might have to take positions that are less than what you would like to make progress. Abraham Lincoln got elected president by going up on the stump and essentially endorsing white supremacy and telling the South, hey, if you'll just come back into the Union, I'll get you a constitutional amendment that slavery is legal forever where it is. And yet Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves. You got to focus on the prize. And sometimes you might have to say or do things to get there. I just rewatched the other night the movie Lincoln, the Steven Spielberg movie Lincoln, with Daniel Day-Lewis, Tommy Lee Jones, Sally Field, in which one of the heroes of the movie is Congressman Thaddeus Stevens, the leader of the so-called Republicans, played by Tommy Lee Jones, masterfully by Tommy Lee Jones, in which he gets up on the House floor and essentially repudiates something he believes in very deeply, which is that every man and woman is created equal, in order to ensure that the anti-slavery amendment will pass.
Mm-hmm. He's being clearly provoked, and
he's being clearly provoked.
It's a great moment because who this guy is, what he believes and his temper. Will he have it to hold it together? This was one of my favorite scenes in that film.
And I would argue that if people care about trans rights, they're not doing trans people any favors by adopting maximalist positions that 80% of the country will not abide. It's the same principle. Sometimes to make progress, you have to maybe take what you see as a step back in order to eventually take a step or two forward. And that is how change is gotten in our system. The American system is not designed, nor will it tolerate quick, radical change. It was, in fact, explicitly designed to avoid that. And that design is not just structural, it's cultural. And you want to go fight that? You want to go try to overturn the culture with a snap of a finger? It's not going to work. And in fact, it's going to backfire on you. That's where you get this, this notion of a backlash. So where we thought we had made a lot of progress, we're now seeing a backlash against it, which of course is predictable. History shows us it's going to happen. But you don't deal with that by throwing more gas on the fire.
Yeah, and I mean, again, this goes back to so much that occurred during the Biden administration. People say that he'll be considered the greatest president of the FDR, but like Jesus, so much historic,
That's lot delusional. These people have lost their minds.
Something I noticed very early on, I felt like Democrats were ignoring it, much like Kamala Harris ignored the they them ads and so forth, was that Republicans had first took the step back of, okay, well, most Americans are sort of, live and let live on same-sex marriage, on gay rights, even on trans rights. They tried to pass the bathroom bill in North Carolina, and that that got Roy Cooper in the governor's mansion just for trying to pass that bill. Republicans thought like, oh, the way in is the kids.
Right.
That is always the way in. We go in with the kids. We're going to say this about it's unfair to kids who are trying to play sports. It's unfair to young girls and who are trying and changing in same-sex spaces. We make it about kids. We make it about that kids are being taught things about sexuality that they're not prepared for. So we'll pass laws against to provoke Democrats. It was a very clear pattern that they leveraged after, and I've written about this, of how one of the big things that occurred during COVID, during when kids were having remote learning, was parents were the first time actually seeing what kids were learning. They had a general sense, okay, you learn to read. Oh, this is the book you're learning to read. And so that confusion was seized on. And I think Democrats often felt, especially along liberal, they don't know how to reach that, as you call it, the Wisconsin single mom, that person. It's not a terrible person, but it's either confused or doesn't understand what's happening, and try to get them on your side, because you've kind of like, you've sort of convinced yourself that a lot of issues, and I think Democrats have done this across the board, a lot of our issues are up there with like, women should have the right to vote. Like, if someone's like, yeah, women should have the right to vote, I'd be like, yeah, that's worth the fuck you, right? Like, that's worth the fuck you response. And I think I should own a black person, but I don't need to get into debate, right? That is the fuck you response. That's where the nation is, because it's 90% of the nation agrees with you. And I think liberals have thought that about things that are essentially 10% issues, and you can't be that.
Right.
That just comes off as arrogance. You just lose because it's like, no, they're going to vote again. You've got to deign to. So, I see where you're coming from, or whatever. Use basic diplomacy. So, and even when, and again, I was even arguing, and I would say this, I was on Blue Sky. I was even arguing about, I am opposed to trans rights or opposed to things. I was just that, like, the far right anti-queer magazine, The Advocate, had an article about how, like, it's now 69% of the nation opposed to, children using facilities at schools that are according to gender identity, not biological sex. Like, you've got to change that, and you've got to figure out how to change that. And it was just sort of like, oh, well, you think my rights or corporate rights has to be debated or changed. Like, that's this has to be fixed. It is like it's like the doctor coming in and saying, Cliston, here's, where all the cancer is. It's like, here's what we need to do. And you're like, oh, so you're pro-cancer.
Right.
You want me to have no, I really don't want you to have here's why we should try to figure out how to do this. And like, oh well, having to have arguments, and frankly, someone like Gavin Newsom, um who I don't think would win. This is not I'm not even pushing Gavin Newsom. I've had to defend Gavin Newsom far more than I would ever have wanted to. But because Gavin, he's going to have to answer to crime in
Yep.
California and all sorts of,
Homelessness.
so, home.
Yep.
But anyway, someone like that, when they're taking a stance, it's because they feel like this is the only way I can win. And so you need to convince them. And I know that sucks to have to convince him, but I don't think Newsom is necessary. And people disagree with me. They think he's a raging transphobe and wants to do these things, or he's anti-queer,
Right.
even though that's not entirely his record. But it's like, no, I think you need. And I compared him to LBJ only in the sense of someone who LBJ was like anti-civil rights in 1950s or whatever. He was reachable. And then there's a Strong Thurmond. Strong Thurmond you're not going to reach. But then there are others who are just like, I just want to get elected. Here's what, and looking at the numbers. And I think that is sort of the sign of like you've got to figure out. That doesn't mean you just roll down and die. It just means you've got to figure out how to reach those people. And I think this goes up to what we saw in Virginia. Again, a state where Democratic victory is not guaranteed. Harris had a very narrow win. Glenn Youngkin won in 2021. And where someone was at this event, Winsome Sears does her anti-trans rant. But again, her anti-trans rant is just saying we need to protect the girls. We need to protect the girl. Like she's saying, we need to protect the girls, keep them separate, blah, blah, blah. Like the average person is just thinking, oh, she wants to protect the girls. I know what she's saying is bigoted and terrible, but that's what she says. She comes out, a Black woman, and there's a white liberal with a thing saying, if trans can't use your bathroom, you can't use my water fountain. And I'm like, or Blacks can't use my water fountain. It's incredibly racist. Because the whole backlash. I've got people telling me, because I wrote about it this week, where I said, oh, she was obviously a GOP plant, but she's not. She was connected. She's with certain groups. It just reflects that sort of complete sort of disconnect between a significant part of the Black coalition and Black voters and a significant number of what white liberals are, how they are viewing these issues. And again, what's the point of it? Like, and people say you shouldn't try to police activists and whatever, but it's like, what's the point? Like, if you're blocking traffic, if you're putting up racist signs, what is your goal? If your goal is to advance your cause, that's not helping. If you just want to be destructive, okay, fine. That's, I guess, blocking traffic's illegal. Not illegal to have racist signs. So if you want to go ahead, do that, but it is fundamentally not helping. There's no history of that ever helping. And people have said, when I mention that, it's like, okay, well, the civil rights movement was never popular. So I don't need to be MLK. I can be this because MLK wasn't popular either. What are your thoughts on that? Because that doesn't seem to kind of hold up.
First of all, the absolute racist idiot who brought that sign to that rally did so much harm, far beyond what any individual should be able to do. But unfortunately, to a large degree, Democrats are judged by the excesses of their activists. And this is, in no small part, because the Democratic Party doesn't push back against it. You can't control what every activist does. That's an unrealistic expectation. But what you can control is how you respond to it. So when you have activists coming out and acting a fool like this, the Democratic Party does itself no favors by not forcefully responding against it. The Democratic Party, some people would call it a Sister Souljah moment or what have you. But the bottom line is, the Democratic Party, unfortunately, is viewed very differently by the average voter than the Republican Party is. The Democratic Party is viewed as culturally out of touch, soft on crime, and various other viewpoints that have taken root. And so there's a larger burden on the Democratic Party to prove that wrong. For rightly or wrongly, the Democratic Party is not as trusted by the public on these hot button issues as Republicans are, and so they get less leeway from voters. So you constantly have to demonstrate to the average voter, the working class mother of two in Kenosha, Wisconsin, that you're not going to go off completely half-cocked like these people who are blocking traffic or taking over university buildings or putting up signs saying that if you don't let trans people in your bathroom, you can't use my water fountain. I mean, the Democratic Party has to come out and forcefully denounce these things if they're going to gain the trust of that 30-something working class mother of two in Kenosha. And people say, well, Republicans don't have to do that. Well, no, they don't. And that's unfair, but that's the way it is. And politics isn't fair.
Well, they're also, it's not that extreme. I mean, Democrats tried with at Trump rallies with those dudes and those guys, but it was viewed as, this is mostly what the party is, and most of what they say I get, and it connects with me. And look, and I've said this before because people were talking about, well, these activists should speak to party folks online, and maybe some academics saying weird stuff and using weird terminology. And it's interesting because it would come from a lot of, I would say, mainstream liberals who, what they would have, legitimate issues with Bernie Sanders, but what drove them, what they fundamentally hated about the Sanders movement was the obnoxious Bernie bros, guys online. And it's like, that was your issue. If only you saw Bernie Sanders at a few rallies or, on TV, be like, he's a socialist, I'm not going to vote for him or whatever. But the contempt came from, these people, they were terrible. These guys were dogpiling women online, saying terrible stuff to them, calling them terrible names, whatever. And that really, I think, made it toxic for him in 2020 because people held that grudge. It wasn't just like, I didn't vote for you. It was just like, everyone associated with you was an idiot and terrible and fair or not. And, and I confess, I had the same way of like, Jesus, these people are terrible. And I would go out in the real world because I live in a more liberal area, and I would meet someone. I'd meet someone who kind of presents like you, right? Who's a Sanders supporter. And I'd be like, okay, well, not everyone is this jerk online, but it was still and I'm a journalist, but my view of that movement was steered by the people I were encountering. And I think that's just human nature. And Democrats have to sort of recognize that. It's only fair. You think about airlines that you hate and you loathe. It's all about what determines that is your experience. It's not the CEO. It's like the person who, lost your luggage, the stewardess who was, or flight attendant who was a jerk to you, the bathrooms being crappy, like all this sort of on the ground stuff. And so I think the Democratic Party is a version of the airline of like Kamala Harris, the CEO, who comes out and gives like a video and then maybe a speech and just like, I'm here for you. And it's like, come fly my airline. You still don't fly because it's like, okay, well, you seem nice enough and whatever, but everyone I come in contact with from flying your airline sucks. And my experience sucks. So I don't trust you. And you've got to fix the folks that you are, even more so, right? Because most younger people, people of color are getting their news, their experience of politics. They aren't seeing the buttoned up, liberal on the Sunday, Meet the Press. No one watches that. They're online, and online are people who are like, here's why white men suck, or here's why we shouldn't have law enforcement. Here's where we're having this stuff. And that's why in the place, I mean, I've been, I've been around the liberal bend, right? I know a lot of folks. I love talking ideas, right? I think we both do. And then sometimes I'll just be like, oh God, prison abolition. I don't like, we can't even talk. Like, why are we talking about this?
Right.
You're a grown person. Like, I want to respect, but like, this is not an issue that anyone is ever going to get elected to anything supporting. And you can call me like a sellout or faithful if I just believe strongly enough that we should just not put people in prison. But it's weird. And I think specifically from the progressives, with all respect, they're not happy with anyone, right? Like if you go to a MAGA, so the new party that's rejected Republicans, but MAGA, they love their guy, they love Trump, okay. And if you go to even never Trumpers, they're like, oh, that Ronald Reagan was awesome, Nixon did some good things. George H.W. Bush was good and it was unfairly served one term. There's like a realistic connection to whatever. But you go to progressives, it's like, we hate Clinton. Obama, bombed nations. He was a warmonger. Yeah. We don't really like anyone. And so despite the kind of history of governance for a century, we believe that the person who can kind of win will be someone to the left of anyone who's ever won the presidency ever at any point in time. And am I missing something there? Is there been like, because then the mainstream liberals don't like FDR because he was, obviously had some racist, had to make deals with segregationists. Like who would you consider the most liberal politician who has won, and what do you think the terms of that would have been? Like, what was that platform that was successful?
It's interesting in that a lot of the politicians who did some of the most liberal things didn't fundamentally code as liberal or progressive when they ran. FDR ran on the notion of balancing the budget. Well, we know he didn't do that. Harry Truman was thought of as this rather conservative sort of Southerner / Midwesterner, and he ended up integrating the military, which may have been one of the greatest advances in furthering racial equality and integration in this country that we've seen. LBJ, as you pointed out, was thought by segregationists for quite some time to be on their side. Lincoln, as I noted, basically said, yeah, white supremacy and Southerners can keep their slaves. And so a lot of the people who did very liberal things that, stood the test of time didn't run on those things. In fact, they ran explicitly against it, or they presented themselves explicitly in a way that you wouldn't necessarily think that would be the way they would go. So as far as who was the most liberal or who did the most liberal things, I mean, I'd have to say probably Lyndon Johnson. But he never came across as a wild-eyed liberal.
Before we go, I know you're a fan of Bashir, but what do you think of Pritzker in Illinois and why he's been able to make certain, because I have some theories about that, about why he's made some positions that Newsom hasn't.
Pritzker is very progressive. He's able to win in Illinois because of the disproportionate population influence of Chicago, Cook County, and the collar counties. I think maybe some of his positions would be hard to sell on a national level. But I think that he has taken a lot of very progressive positions. And in my view, I think he's probably at least as unelectable as Gavin Newsom. But there's this notion that because he's a Midwesterner, that will somehow blunt some of those edges. I don't see that necessarily. I don't really think that J.B. Pritzker would be a very good presidential candidate. I hope he does not win the nomination. I have nothing against him personally, but I just don't think he's going to win. I think he, much like Newsom, would be identified with some of the urban problems that are happening in Chicago in his case, or San Francisco or Oakland in Newsom's case. And I'm not sure why people think he would. I mean, I know there's this bias against California that maybe there isn't against a Midwestern state, but there is a bias against Chicago. I can assure you of that.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I think Newsom has also staked out some claims because it's kind of like if you look at Dirty Harry films that are set in the in San Francisco, it's like it's sort of not just the violence, it's the culture that's sort of demonized, right? And
Yeah,
I think that's what you're sort of have to sort of stake yourself out as not being part of that culture. Whereas Pritzker's at least is the Midwest, so he can then just say, I don't have to necessarily prove myself here, but I do need to say I will actually, do law and order. But I mean, that
yeah,
would still be a challenge. It is interesting because there's this view that Republicans can double down on their worst instincts or feast their base. I'm not even sure that's true. I think uh, Republicans have been listening to their consultants, and Democrats need to stop as well. So after 2012, it was like, here's why Romney lost. And it was like, we need to moderate more on issues. But that's what the consultants thought. If you looked on the ground, which was what Trump was, because he was on the ground, he was a Fox
hmm,
News, he's the Fox News viewer turned president, right?
yeah,
And he was like, no, I can run on not liking immigration, especially illegal immigration. I can run on, you know, uh, base voters don't care about these Paul Ryan style domestic, so I can go against the orthodoxy there and say certain things and make lip service, and no one will, I can run as a faux populist and it won't hurt me because that's what the base
yeah.
wants to hear. And so I'm not sure that we kind of have that Trump, sort of the good Trump, the one who has an ear on what the actual voters in Democratic primary are really where they can kind of legitimately double down or what really values other than like actually fight Republicans. So
Yeah.
Newsom, Pritzker are succeeding in doing that. And I think someone like Whitmer or others were just sort of listening to consultants and saying, well, just do good governance. People will appreciate that you at least tried to work with Trump, which I don't think is not going to get you
No.
through a primary. It just makes you look weak.
Mhm.
Even if you're sort of conceding Trump won my state, Trump has power. I mean, that was what the advantage DeSantis had, right? Was that he was someone that even after 2020, even after Georgia flipped, he was like, still won Florida, gotta fight Biden. And he's a terrible politician. But before we go, I have this last one. Do you think he would have had a chance if Trump had not, in a world where Trump had gone away, if Garland had done his job and it was just the primary was pretty much non-Trump, but DeSantis and Haley and the rest?
I think Haley likely would have run roughshod over Ron DeSantis. Um, you know, it sounds odd to say in the age of Trump, personality does matter, and Ron DeSantis is sort of like Donald Trump with all of his faults but none of his charm. Now I say that sort of in a sarcastic way because I don't think Trump has any charm, but Trump has an ability to connect with people that DeSantis does not. DeSantis comes across as a very I'm trying to think of words that aren't pejorative. But the bottom line is he's just not a likable person. Now, I don't find Trump likable either, but some people do. I do not think that DeSantis would have gotten out of the primaries. I think Nikki Haley probably would have won the nomination and almost certainly would have become president.
Oh yeah. And there are ways that the nation would have been better, ironically enough, not for a lot of those 20% issues, because she was already running on
Oh,
those
yeah.
20% issues. So yeah. Once again, thank you so much for coming on, talking us through some of what we're seeing. Cliston Brown, where can folks find you on your website,
You can
ClistonBrown.com?
find me at mostly on X or Twitter, as whatever you prefer to call it. I still like to call it Twitter, uh, at CB Politics.
Right, great. Thank you so much. We'll check you next time. Take care.